Hello and welcome to the B41 Adaptation to the Environment review video. This one is a really interesting section. It relates back to natural selection. It specifically relates back to the standard about abiotic factors as selection pressures. And it kind of investigates why do organisms have the adaptations they do, why do they look the way they do, specifically related to the environment on the abiotic factors. And so we start with standard 1, and standard 1 is the definition of a habitat. And so habitat is the place organisms live. And you could, that for organisms, it could be species, population, or community. It's any of them. So it's just where organisms live, and it includes the geographical location, so like where are you? The physical location, like what does it look like where you are? And the type of ecosystem that you're in. And so what does the ecosystem look like? So this is the habitat of an organism. And so different organisms have different adaptations to their habitats. And so the main ones you're supposed to know for IB are sand dunes. So sand dunes are a salty, sandy habitat. There's not a lot of like good soil. They can be really salty from the ocean water hitting it. So these are in like the coastal intertidal zone. And so there are grass species that can grow in these sand dunes. And these grass species often have adaptations. They have these roots, and these roots allow them to survive in that area. One example is American beach grass. And American beach grass has a really large and strong rhizome. So what is a rhizome? So it's basically an underground stem. And it puts out lateral shoots at different intervals. And this is to help anchor it into the ground. And so it would look like this. So this would be the stem, this would be the sand dune, and then it would shoot up, well, that's not the best picture, but it would shoot up grass at different intervals like that. And so this is the rhizome that helps hold it in place, and it allows it to anchor in the sandy and the salty environments. The other one you need to know is mangroves, which is like, makes me laugh because it's like that you need to know about, let me read it. It's mangrove swamps. Okay, so I guess it's technically mangrove swamps. Well, mangrove swamps are groups of mangroves. There's 80 different species of mangrove trees in the world, and these different trees have special adaptations. And the main one they have are their prop roots. Their prop roots look like this. So they're those weird trees that look like this, and then they grow up. And so they have this area here, and so this allows them to survive the different tides. So as the tides come in and out, they can survive and not be knocked over. And so it looks like they're on stilts above the water. This also helps them balance out the salt that is in the water too, because salt is normally really bad for a plant. If you were to put salt water on a plant, you would pretty much kill it. But these have special adaptations that allow them to survive. Okay. 3. So abiotic factors affecting species distributions. And so there are a lot of abiotic factors that can affect the distribution of a species. And so it's where can they survive. So a reminder, what are our abiotic factors? Well, our abiotic factors are things like temperature, pH, salinity, humidity, and oxygen levels. So all of these affect where an organism can survive. And so an example would be a sugar maple tree. These can only survive in certain temperatures from negative 18 degrees C to 27 degrees C. Tropical fish, right, they have limits to where they can survive in temperature. They also have limits to their salinity. Freshwater fish versus tropical fish can take different amounts of salinity. There's different types of fish. There's tropical fish, there's temperate fish, Arctic fish, and they can each survive at different temperatures as well. So these abiotic factors affect where you can find different species. And it leads to what's called a range of tolerance. And so you have the abiotic factor on the bottom, and you have population size here, and this gives you the range of tolerance. And it's going to be, typically for most, it's a bell curve that looks something like this. And so this is where they're happy. This is the optimum zone. This is the zone of physiological stress. And then they don't survive outside that range. And so that is our range of tolerance. And so range of tolerance is, the next standard actually is related to range of tolerance as well. So range of tolerance is a limiting factor on population size and distribution. So it limits both population size and distribution. So this is why you can't find, most organisms cannot be found all over the world. There are rare exceptions, but most of them cannot. And so this is where we did our transect study. So remember, a transect is different from the random quadrats. Our transect is where you are like going in a line where where that abiotic factor is changing. And so a really common example is the rocky shore. And so when you start here, like right at the high tide mark, and you go down to the low tide mark, one of the things that changes is an abiotic factor, right? Temperature would change, the water level would change, etc. And so then you can sample here and here and here and here, and you would look to see how do the species change as you move into the water. And so you would expect to see different species at different heights. So here you would expect a species that is more heat tolerant. Here you would expect a species that needs to stay wet. And so that is an example of range of tolerance limiting distribution of a species. The next thing you need to know about is coral reefs. And so coral reefs are not found all over the world at all. They're really only found about 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south of the equator. So they're found between the two tropics, right? So the corals are found throughout here, but they're still only found in certain areas. So one of the reasons you find them near the tropics is because they're very sensitive to temperature. They need it to be warm to like hot, but not too hot. They're kind of like Goldilocks. They need a high salinity value, so they need the water to be pretty salty. They need lots of light, so they need clear water. They need clear water. Warm to hot. For pH, they need a high pH, typically something above 7.7. Most species are really more above 8, so a pretty high pH value. And then water depth, right? So they need to be in pretty shallow water, talking 25 meters or higher. So all of these things need to happen for you to find coral reefs. And so you can see kind of why they're not really found in very many places, because of these limiting factors that affect their range of tolerance. So that's aquatic. For our land, our terrestrial biomes. So we talked about the ecosystems earlier. Well, when we said ecosystems, how do we know what kind of ecosystem is going to develop? And this is for land biomes only, because you'll see why in a second. There are two main factors that affect it. They are temperature and rainfall, and now you can see why it's land only, because you already have water in the ocean. And so temperature and rainfall affect which is going to happen. And so we looked at graphs that look like this. We specifically looked at Whittaker's climate graph, as well as climate graphs where they're both on the y-axis. But so if you do it like this, with temperature here and precipitation here, you need to look at it carefully, because on Whittaker's climate graph, they actually start with it here, and then it goes in this direction, and it gets colder as you go. And so what we notice is that, so here we have like our desert, over here we would have our like savanna, and up here we have our rainforest, okay? And this would be like a savanna. Over here you'd have tundra, so low rain and low temp, etc. And so you can see there's a bunch of them. They look like this, and you can see the different ones. And so these are the factors that affect what ecosystem will show up, are temperature and rainfall. We call these different ecosystems that show up more than once biomes. We call them biomes. And so all around the world, we get biomes forming. And biomes are forming because of the similar abiotic conditions. And so we have similar temps and rainfalls. And then, since the climate is similar, you get convergent evolution happening, which causes the organisms that live there to look similar. And so remember, this is not from a common ancestor. This is where they look the same because they're in a similar environment. And we see this happening a lot with biomes. And so you need to know certain biomes. You need to know what makes them the way they are. So you need to know tropical forest, temperate forest, taiga, grassland, tundra, and hot desert. The easiest two, in my opinion, are hot desert, which is high temp, no rain. Oh, tundra is easy too. Low temp, no rain. Tropical forest is high temp, high rain. Then the middle three are a little more unique, right? So our temperate forest is going to have kind of fluctuating temperatures, averaging around medium, with still pretty decent rainfall, so medium to high rainfall. At least medium rain. The taiga, on the other hand, is going to be cold, but not as cold as the tundra, and it's going to have some rain, but not like a large amount of rain. Our grasslands are going to be intermediate temperatures, so kind of depends on whether you're talking about more of a temperate grassland or a savanna, where the temperatures would be. So for a typical like temperate grassland, though, the temperatures would be very similar to a temperate forest with fluctuating temperatures, and so you'd have anywhere from like warm to cold depending on the time of year. And typically you're going to have low-ish rainfall. So you're going to have lower rainfall. It's possibly even less than the taiga, depending on what it looks like. So typically, your temperate forest is going to have more rain than a grassland. So like this one would be medium and this one would be low. So these are our different biomes. And so you are expected to know these rough climate conditions. This graph here, if you memorize this graph, it would actually tell you the climate conditions as well. So that might be a good way to do it. Okay, the last concept here is probably my favorite, is adaptations to life in the hot desert or the tropical rainforest. And so there are many different plants and animals that live in these areas, and they have many adaptations for the areas. Well, sorry, there's many animals that live in the tropical rainforest. There is not that many that live in the hot desert. But for the hot desert, we have like our camels, right, with the hump that stores fat for the water. So they store fat to help keep them from getting dehydrated and to give them water, food, like energy. There's also a desert tortoise. That's a more local one. This is our endangered native animal to California. So this is the state reptile of California and Nevada. And it's very endangered, but it digs burrows, right? And so it has a lot of adaptations for digging burrows. It has its claws. It has special claws on its front legs that allow it to dig burrows. In the desert, we have cacti. And so there's cacti, right? So like the saguaro is a really big one. They have a thick, waxy coating. They have spines to protect themselves. And they have reduced or no leaves. So a lot of them have no leaves at all, which allows them to minimize water loss. So theirs are all about minimizing water loss or defending themselves from animals so that the animals don't steal their water too, right? In the tropical rainforest, I love tigers, so we'll talk about tigers, right? They have their striped coat to blend in with the patterns. We saw the okapi had its really dark velvet body to help blend in, as well as the stripes to break up the pattern. Clouded leopards are another great example. They've got that pattern that looks kind of like clouds or like leaves in a tree. For plants, for this one, we have what are called drip tips. And so drip tips are a climbing plant. And they have aerial roots. And this allows them to attach to different trees. And so they can actually survive in the air. So they're actually like attached to another tree. And then they have very pointy leaves to drain excess water because it rains a lot. So they have these pointy leaves to drain excess water, which is a cool adaptation. And that is B41.